everybody, welcome to Black Americana. I'm Ashley, and in this video we are doing a deep dive into the history of Mississippi and how it aligns with the movie Sinners. Since the film was released, I have seen so many questions about the history of Mississippi and how it relates to the film. So I said, you know what, that's up my alley and in my backyard, so why don't we do a video? Now, this is not about the symbolism, and it is not a full-out movie review, but I do hope it enhances the conversations that have been sparked around this movie. So if you're ready, keep watching. Reconstruction was the period during and after the Civil War where the South was tasked with ridding itself of its antebellum ways. It was an incredibly complicated time for Black Americans. Some thrived, with Mississippi electing the first Black United States Senator, Hiram Revels. In contrast, many Black Americans were in utter confusion on where to go and how to provide for themselves. Many former slaves starved, returned to their former plantations to find work, or were jailed for being homeless. Even with these challenges, some Black Americans were determined not to return to the field for work. As the wealthy planter class navigated this new reality in the South, they brought in Chinese men to supplement the loss of slavery, but their time picking cotton didn't last long. By the 1870s, the Chinese became merchants throughout the Delta, specifically in Black communities. As time went on, the Chinese essentially became a buffer class. The phrase buffer class is not one we usually associate with the United States, but within Black and white dichotomies, they do exist. A lot of people were excited to see the Mississippi Delta Chinese in Sinners because it is a novelty in Hollywood, and many were unaware of their presence in the Mississippi Delta. But for some who are familiar with the history, they were unsettled by how the Black and Chinese dynamic was portrayed. Many might be asking, how did the Chinese manage to leapfrog Black Americans so quickly in the Mississippi Delta? For one, the Chinese had a trade partner in their home country. Black Americans have never had such. This is not an attempt to play Oppression Olympics, but just to give the reality of the situation. Black Americans are a stateless people other than the United States. Most white planters and merchants were not willing to supply the goods for a viable Black-owned store. Although the Chinese faced prejudice in the United States as well, they had another source to acquire goods. A lot of people don't know that the economic model the Mississippi Delta Chinese created has been replicated by other immigrant groups for generations now. So it is basically step one. Find an economically depressed, predominantly Black community that is unlikely to be granted funding and permits to sustain a business. Step 2. Trade with your country of origin or utilize an immigrant program to supply the business. One thing I want to reiterate is that when the Chinese arrived in the Mississippi Delta, only the men came. During this time, the United States was more restrictive on chain migration. Chinese men lived in the Black community and mated with Black women. Some Chinese men and Black women married and started families. As the Chinese grew in number in the Mississippi Delta and more Chinese women became eligible for immigration, the Chinese began to discourage interracial relationships, leading some Chinese men to abandon the children they had with Black women. For interracial families that remained intact, their children were raised as Black. More Chinese also sought to join white Baptist churches. With Chinese men and Chinese women now having children on American soil, education became a controversy. The Chinese were allowed to open their own school where their children were taught in the Chinese academic tradition. Still, some Chinese parents wanted to send their children to public school, which led to one of the most hostile episodes in Black and Chinese relations. Gong and Catherine Lum were Chinese immigrants in the Mississippi Delta who had American-born children. When their children reached school age, they were permitted to attend the white school until the passage of what is known as the Asian Exclusion Act in 1924. And as the name indicates, it was designed to restrict immigration from Asia. Upon this federal law being passed, the white school expelled the Lum children. Gong and Catherine filed a lawsuit that reached the Supreme Court, arguing their children had a right to attend the white school. Some might ask, why was this controversial? Didn't Black Americans fight for the same thing? The answer is no. As we move further away from the civil rights movement, the Black American fight for desegregation has been repackaged as Black parents wanted their Black children to become friends with white children. School desegregation was about resources, not friendship. Schools were segregated on the premise of separate but equal, meaning that the Black and white students attended separate schools, but they were supposed to be equally funded. As we know, that did not happen. So say a Black child wants to be a doctor, but the school said child attends has no science lab. The child's parents find out the white school in their town has a state-of-the-art science lab. The only way the Black child could obtain access to that lab was to attend the white school. Remember, these segregated schools were still controlled by white school boards. The Black schools were often given old textbooks from the white schools, provided limited elective classes, and had neglected infrastructure. Naturally, many Black parents wanted their children to access the well-funded public schools that their taxes went towards. Still, integration was a difficult decision for Black parents, and none of them in their right mind allowed their children to risk life and limb in the name of making diverse friends. Their mindset was to survive in this country and hope to one day thrive. Their children must access adequate education. That was not what the Lum family was arguing. Their case argued that their children being associated with Negroes, as Black Americans were known then, would hurt their social status. They feared being classified as a Negro family because Blackness was a contaminant. Listen to political scientist Claire Jean Kim explain the dynamic in this clip.
There was, in the early 1900s through the mid-century, increased mobility for Chinese Americans in the South because of living in a black-white order, right, a segregated order, living under Jim Crow. They were offered certain inducements to come closer to whiteness if they would repudiate black people, and they did that in very stark ways. For example, this is covered in the book and the film. The book Mississippi Chinese and the film was called Mississippi Triangle. And many of the Chinese grocers who lived in the Mississippi Delta, for example, in the 1920s, by the way, this is the community that gave rise to the Supreme Court case Gong Lam v. Rice, where Chinese Americans challenged the placement of their children in so-called colored schools, and because they wanted to be able to go to school with whites. And their argument, very dramatically, was we Chinese people, being pure Chinese, deserve protection from the contamination of blackness as much as you white students do. That's why we should be able to go to school with white students. So they failed, but they sort of subverted the decision in the Supreme Court by just saying we refuse to go to school with Black children, so we're going to form our own schools or go to religious schools, etc. Okay, so this was the community that gave rise to that case. And many of the grocers had married Black women and had children who were biracial. And the white school boards, the white leaders in the town were quite explicit in the Mississippi Delta. They said, if you repudiate your Black kin, we will allow you to come closer to whiteness. And that's what many of them did. Not all of them, but many of them did. And this was why they experienced, the Chinese American community in the Delta, significant social mobility, like up through World War II and just past.
The Lums were not fighting to obtain equality. They were fighting to obtain whiteness. This is the difference between their case, which they lost before the Supreme Court, and Brown versus the Board of Education, which ended the separate but equal doctrine. While I understand Ryan Coogler wanted the Chinese at the juke joint, I wish he had used a more historically accurate way to do it. Perhaps a Chinese couple did patronize a juke joint, but any such interaction would be an outlier because history supports that many Chinese believed social isolation from the black community was key to improving their social standing. Granted, the Black and Chinese experience in the Mississippi Delta is not a monolith. It varied from town to town, store to store, and family to family. As the civil rights movement progressed, Black and Chinese relations further deteriorated. Desegregation also neutralized the Mississippi Delta Chinese as an economic force. Today, there is only about a fifth of the Chinese/Chinese American population remaining in the Mississippi Delta compared to the 1960s.